In 2023, the fight for Rookie of the Year was almost as predictable as the fight for the championship. Oscar Piastri, coming into the season with very high expectations, had a lot to live up to. But not only do I think that he delivered on that hype and expectation, I think he was arguably one of the most exciting aspects of the season. I think it's important to also just rewind the clock back to last year, because when looking at Oscar's season, context is very, very important. Since 2021, there was already a lot of noise around Piastri, because just like Russell and Leclerc before him, he also won the equivalent F3 and F2 titles in successive seasons. In fact, Piastri belongs in an even more exclusive club because prior to that, he also won the Formula Renault Euro Cup the year before, meaning that to my knowledge, he is probably the only driver to win 3 different major single-seater championships in 3 successive seasons. Or when you look at just how good Russell and Leclerc went on to be in Formula 1, it was easy to get excited about the prospect of Piastri, but then when you consider how he landed in Formula 1 with McLaren, that's what made him the driver that I was most excited to see going into 2023. Off the back of the whole fiasco in 2022, and his now infamous tweet of rejecting Alpine's announcement that he'd be driving for them, and instead announcing a move to McLaren, which literally sent the entire F1 world into meltdown, there was a lot of pressure on his shoulders coming into the season. Not only would he have to live up to his single-seater success, but he'd also have to justify McLaren's decision to drop Ricciardo in his final contract year at a tune of $18 million to do so. That is why when you consider the pressure that was on his shoulders and the really impressive rookie season that he then went on to have, that is why some fans started to compare it to what we saw from the likes of Leclerc in 2018 and even Verstappen in 2015. However, before we get into those comparisons, let's actually talk about the season itself. And now, much like McLaren itself, I think you can almost split his season in half. The beginning of the season was very impressive because he started to show really promising glimpses of quality even before he got the major McLaren upgrades in Silverstone that turned their season around. Reaching Q3 in just his second race, scoring his first points during his home race, and also the fact that during the first 8 races, he never finished more than 2 places behind Lando on track. Those early races, whilst on paper not anything special, were a really solid base to start from. He scored his first points in just his 3rd race, so straight away I think quite a bit of the pressure was lifted off his shoulders, and he also didn't have too many incidents that were his fault. When you compare that to the other rookies in Sargent and De Vries who had multiple incidents during the same period, whilst we always give allowances to rookies for incidents, it doesn't mean that it doesn't pile on the pressure. Unlike with Sargent and De Vries, Piastri never allowed himself to get into those situations in the first place, and it was obvious that compared to them, he was immediately a level above. When he finally received those upgrades in Silverstone, and having seen what Lando was able to do with them in Austria, the fact that he was able to immediately be right up there, bang on the pace and improve with the car, was one of the most impressive moments. He qualified 3rd on the grid, less than a 10th behind Lando, and throughout the race at the sharp end of the grid with the best drivers and under big pressure, it didn't faze him whatsoever. Had it not have been for the safety car which allowed Lewis to jump him at the pit stops, he would have finished on the podium with his teammates in just his first race with the upgraded McLaren. From Spa onwards during the last 11 races of the season, we really started to see Piastri reach new heights. Now, I would love to go through each and every single one of those last 11 races, but to save time, there is 3 races that stand out in particular that I want to talk about, because I think certain aspects of those weekends really capture why Piastri's rookie season as a whole was so special. Firstly, right off the bat, Spa was the weekend where I think people really started to sit up and take notice. Despite the fact that in the race he got taken out by Sainz on lap 1, the entire weekend showcased his exceptional pace in the wet. He outqualified Lando in both regular and also sprint qualifying, starting 2nd, and then went on to convert that in the sprint, never falling into any trouble behind him because he always had the pace to stay out of it. And next up was Singapore. Now, this was a race where Lando got all of the plaudits for finishing 2nd, and rightly so, but Oscar also had one of his best races of the season. Coming into the weekend, he had to use an older spec compared to Lando, as Lando had priority in upgrades. But worse than that, due to Lance Stroll's crash which brought out the red flag in Q1, it knocked Piastri out as he was unable to finish his lap, meaning around one of the most difficult tracks to overtake on, he would be starting 17th for the race. From 17th, he made a brilliant start, making up a few positions to move up into 14th early on, and then from there he stayed out of trouble, managed to pass a few cars out on track, and finished 7th by the end of the race. Making up 10 places around Singapore is no joke, and it was a low-key but impressive show of his racecraft and race execution around a very difficult track. Finally, we get to Qatar, which was undoubtedly the highlight of his and McLaren's season. And now, whilst both of the drivers by their own admission under-delivered in qualifying, the rest of the weekend for Piastri was a display of everything that made his rookie season so great. Qualifying ahead of his teammate in both quali and in the shootout was absolutely the key to his win in the sprint and his second place in the race. There's no doubt that Lando during the race had more raw pace than Piastri, but throughout the weekend Piastri showed that he always had enough and he never cracked under pressure. In the sprint he had to repass Russell and defend from Sainz and Verstappen, and in the race Lando Leighton was also applying massive pressure. Taking away that track limits mistake in qualifying, it was a complete performance that was almost Verstappen-esque in execution. It showed us Piastri's talent at its absolute best, and it also showed us that in the right car and with a bit more experience, if he could reel off those types of weekends consistently in the future, race after race, he could definitely be a challenger for the title. Looking back at his season, whilst his consistency definitely needs to improve, I will also say that a lot of the time he definitely had his fair share of bad luck, with a reliability issue on his debut, and in particular, he seemed to get involved in quite a few lap 1 incidents that, looking back, I don't think any of them were really his fault. In Jeddah he got taken out by Gasly, in Spa he got taken out by Sainz, in Austin he got taken out by Ocon, and in Sao Paulo he was an innocent victim in the Magnussen and Albon collision. When it comes to his one-lap pace relative to Lando, this was probably the thing that improved the most. During the first 11 races, his record against Lando was just 1-10, whilst in the last 11, he actually outqualified Lando 6-5. Over one lap and up against a really fast driver, he was massively impressive. But in the races, there's no doubt that Lando had a clear edge. Now, I am not going to sit here and say that his race pace and tyre management didn't improve over the course of the season, because of course it did. But it didn't improve as much as perhaps I was expecting it to. During the back end of the season, despite outqualifying Lando in races like Japan, Mexico and Abu Dhabi, in all of those races he then fell back and couldn't match Lando during the race. Japan was probably the best example of his yet underdeveloped tyre wear. The two McLarens started at the front and were basically racing no one, with Max being too fast up at the front and the teams behind being too slow. And yet despite that, Oscar finished the race over 17 seconds behind Lando and put his lack of pace down to tyre degradation. After the race he said, "I just wasn't quick enough at certain points of the race. You know, these high deg races are probably the biggest thing I need to try and work on at the moment." That comment after getting his first podium, and similar comments that he's made this season, is another thing I think has been really impressive about Piastri. He's a driver who is always very self-critical and always looks at himself first before blaming the car or anyone else. He strikes me as a very analytical driver, and his almost robotic mentality has actually really impressed me. His manager Mark Webber, who of course is the ex-Red Bull and 8-time Grand Prix winner, I think did a really good job in advising him this season. I have no doubt in my mind that off the back of the whole Alpine fiasco in 22 and all of the noise and pressure that that incident generated, I think that Mark Webber coming into the season definitely told Oscar something like, "Look, for your first year and after everything that happened last year, just keep your head down. Say the stuff that you need to say in the media, don't give them any more than they need, and keep everything close to your chest." I have heard lots of people be critical of Oscar, saying that he's quite boring compared to the other drivers, but I think that's fully intentional. I'm sure as he gets more settled and established in Formula 1 next year that we'll see more of his natural character shine through, but for now, I think that Oscar and his team made the right choice and did a very good job in media training him to be as critical and analytical as he is, whilst at the same time not saying or doing anything that might bring even more pressure on his shoulders. Regardless of what anyone else thinks, the most important judge of Piastri's rookie season is McLaren themselves, and their actions will always speak louder than words. They extended Piastri's contract and tied him down until the end of 2026, which shows that not only were they impressed with his rookie season and that they have full confidence in him for the future, but if anything does happen to Lando and if he does decide to leave, they have got another superstar waiting in the wings. How you judge Piastri's rookie season I think depends a lot on how you also judge Lando Norris as a driver. I have had Lando in my top 5 drivers of the season for 3 years running now, so even though he is still yet to win a race, that should tell you everything you need to know about how highly I rate Lando. The fact that in the second half of the season Piastri over 1 lap was as close to Norris as he was, I think shows that Piastri at his peak, when he puts everything together, can be as quick as the very best. And now granted, he hasn't been able to put everything together enough, and the consistency hasn't quite been there, but that's to be expected. If he can maintain that 1 lap pace, which in the second half of the season was just as good as Lando's, and improve his pace on the Sunday, he would elevate himself into that Norris-Leclerc level of drivers. In terms of the teammate head-to-head with Lando, I think it's worth just reiterating that although Piastri was very impressive, and especially in qualifying was very close being less than 0.2 slower over the course of the season, we also have to be fair in saying that Lando definitely still dominated Oscar. Oscar only scored 97 points in comparison to Lando's 205, and that means that he only contributed 32.1% of the team's total points. Now, I have a very rough rule of thumb that to me, if an experienced driver is contributing anything lower than 38 or 37% compared to their teammate, that's beginning to be danger territory and certainly means that you're being dominated. For example, compared to Piastri's 32.1, Checo contributed just 33.1% to Red Bull, and Lance Stroll contributed just 26.4% to Aston Martin. And now, I regard both of those drivers as having pretty bad seasons relative to their teammates and given the cars that they had. And so whilst Piastri is obviously not in that conversation, I think it's also just important to also not overrate what Piastri did at McLaren compared to his teammate. Speaking of Norris, there's actually quite a lot of similarities between his and Piastri's rookie seasons at McLaren. Piastri faced a Norris who was in his 5th season in Formula 1, whilst Norris faced a Sainz who was also in his 5th season, albeit 2019 was both of the drivers' first seasons at McLaren, which I think is important to remember. Over on Twitter, as I usually do, I wanted to know who the fans thought was more impressive between Oscar and Lando during their respective rookie seasons at McLaren, and after almost 5,000 votes, the results were emphatically in Oscar's favour, with over 78% of the vote. And now, Norris actually beat Sainz in their quali head-to-head 11-10 as a rookie. But then again, Sainz has never been known for his quali pace, so it wasn't entirely surprising. And as you'd expect with his experience and particularly his race execution, which we have seen many times at Ferrari since then, it really came through as he also dominated Norris on the Sundays, and in the end, Lando contributed a not too dissimilar to Oscar 33.8% of McLaren's points. Although you'll never get a like-for-like comparison in Formula 1, I actually think Oscar and Lando were in fairly similar situations and had fairly similar rookie seasons up against really strong teammates. Although the fans' vote was emphatically towards Oscar, I think that it's a hell of a lot closer than that. And to me, because Lando was a little bit more consistent in the races, I think he'd probably just edge out Oscar. Regardless with how impressive Oscar's rookie season was, it's understandable that comparisons to other rookie seasons would be made, and in particular to Verstappen and Leclerc. Over on Twitter, I once again sent out another classic poll asking for which one was best, and this time almost 16,000 people voted, which is a really good sample size, and the vote was incredibly close between all 3 drivers, with Verstappen coming out on top, Leclerc in second, and Piastri a close third. Which driver you think had the best rookie season and how you'd rank all 4 rookie seasons compared to each other is something I would really like to know in the comments below. Fundamentally, with something so subjective, there are so many factors to consider. The performance of the car, the level of teammate that each of the drivers had, and then the stuff you can't even put a number to, like the amount of pressure that was on each driver going in, are all really important factors outside of what they actually achieved. It also really depends on what type of rookie season you think is more impressive. Piastri and Norris were impressive because of how close they were to already very highly rated and experienced drivers, whilst Leclerc and Verstappen were impressive because they dominated either similarly experienced or lesser talented drivers in the same car. And now, I'm not going to go in depth by analysing all of their rookie seasons now because for Verstappen and Leclerc, I've actually already done very in-depth videos doing that already, and I'll leave a link to them in the description if you want to check them out. Having watched them all and comparing them side by side, my ranking of their rookie seasons would be Verstappen at number 1, followed by Leclerc, Norris, and then Piastri. And now, that is not a slight on Piastri by any means because that is very elite company that he finds himself in. Regardless of where you rank him or how good he was up against Norris, the mere fact that he lived up to the hype after all of the noise in 2022 and that he is justifiably in the conversation with the other drivers should tell you how much potential this guy has. We are not lacking championship capable talent in F1 by any means, and the best compliment that I can give Piastri's rookie season is that not only does he belong in the company of drivers like Norris, Leclerc and Russell, but if he continues to improve at the rate that he was in the second half of 2023, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that he could also become a champion in the future. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.